Dorothy Mae Harrison's weathered hands froze mid-reach toward the trembling shadow pressed against the cold brick wall, her morning coffee tumbling forgotten to the concrete below. What she'd mistaken for an abandoned kitten wasn't a kitten at all. Those distinctive tufted ears and wild green eyes belonged to something that shouldn't exist this close to civilization. Jake Running Bear dropped his maintenance toolkit with a metallic crash, the sound echoing through the alley as he backed away from the impossible sight. "Ma'am, that's a bobcat," he whispered, his voice catching in his throat like gravel. The tiny creature's ribs showed through matted fur, and Dorothy's mind flashed to Madison's frail form in that hospital bed 6 months ago. Another innocent life slipping away while adults stood helpless. But this time was different. "Call animal control," Jake urged, reaching for his phone with shaking fingers, though every instinct screamed this was already too late for official protocols. Who had torn this baby from its mother, and how many others were suffering in shadows they hadn't yet discovered? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Dorothy Mae Harrison had weathered 73 years of life's storms, but nothing had prepared her for the emptiness that followed Madison's funeral 6 months ago. The 8-year-old granddaughter who used to fill her modest Prescott home with laughter and sticky fingerprints had left behind only silence and the crushing weight of unfulfilled promises. "Save all the kitties, Nana," had been Madison's final whispered request, her small hand clutching Dorothy's as leukemia claimed another innocent soul. Now Dorothy sat alone each evening at her kitchen table, setting 2 places out of habit before remembering with a fresh stab of grief that Harold was 2 years gone and Madison would never again steal bites of her famous apple pie. Her son Michael called twice a week with the same concerned tone and the same suggestion about Sunset Manor assisted living. "It's for your own good, Mom," he'd say, as if she couldn't hear the relief in his voice at the prospect of no longer worrying about his declining mother. What Michael didn't understand was that Dorothy wasn't declining. She was drowning. The woman who had once tracked endangered species across 3 continents for National Geographic, who had photographed wolves in Alaska and jaguars in the Amazon, now struggled to find reasons to get dressed each morning. The forced retirement 3 years ago had been sold as budget cuts, but Dorothy knew the truth. She'd refused to reveal the location of a sacred Cherokee site where rare animals nested, protecting both the wildlife and the indigenous people who considered the land holy. The magazine executives hadn't appreciated her obstinate principles, as they'd called her moral code. Jake Running Bear understood that kind of principled stubbornness. At 45, the Cherokee maintenance worker carried his own burden of disgrace. Once a decorated police detective, he'd discovered a corruption ring that reached deep into the department's hierarchy. When he'd tried to expose it, he'd found himself isolated, investigated, and ultimately forced to resign. Now he supported his twin 16-year-old daughters, Emma and Sarah, with maintenance work that paid a fraction of his former salary, but allowed him to sleep at night. Jake's route through Prescott's aging buildings had become a meditation of sorts. He knew which warehouses held memories of better times, which abandoned lots harbored secrets, and which forgotten corners might shelter those society had discarded. His Cherokee grandmother had taught him that every creature had medicine to offer, even broken ones, and that wisdom guided him through the maze of his current circumstances. Neither Dorothy nor Jake could have predicted that their separate paths of loss and redemption would converge on this gray October morning behind Morrison's old hardware building. Both carried wounds that hadn't healed. Both struggled with the weight of doing what was right in a world that often punished integrity. But sometimes, as Dorothy's Cherokee friends might say, the Great Spirit places exactly the right people in exactly the right place when someone small and helpless needs them most. Jake Running Bear had been checking the electrical systems in the abandoned warehouse district when he first heard the sound, a thin, desperate crying that cut through the morning silence like a blade. His Cherokee grandmother had taught him to listen for voices others missed, and this voice was calling for help in a language older than words. Following the sound around the corner of Morrison's old hardware building, Jake discovered the source huddled against the brick wall where two buildings met. At first glance, it looked like any abandoned kitten, matted fur, protruding ribs, eyes clouded with infection. But those ears, those distinctive black tufted ears, made his breath catch in his throat. This wasn't a domestic cat. This was a Bobcat Kitten, no more than 3 weeks old, dying alone behind a dumpster. Jake's hands trembled as he pulled out his phone. Every instinct screamed that this was wrong. Baby bobcats didn't wander into town alone. Someone had put this kitten here, but why? His detective training, rusty from years of maintenance work, began cataloging details. The kitten's condition suggested recent abandonment, not days of wandering. The location was too convenient, too visible for someone making regular rounds. Someone had wanted this kitten to be found, but by whom? And more importantly, found alive or dead? The weight of past failures pressed against Jake's chest as he stared at the tiny, helpless creature. How many times during his police career had he arrived too late, found evidence instead of survivors? How many families had he faced with empty hands and hollow apologies? The corruption scandal that ended his career had started with his refusal to look the other way when evidence suggested departmental involvement in covering up crimes. Now, faced with another potential crime scene, he felt that familiar knot of moral obligation tightening in his stomach. But this time, he could act before it was too late. Dorothy Harrison lived only 6 blocks away in the modest craftsman home she'd shared with Harold for 43 years. Jake remembered her from his police days. Harold's car accident 2 years ago had required a thorough investigation, and Dorothy's quiet dignity in the face of tragedy had impressed him. More importantly, he remembered the photographs covering every wall of their home. Exotic animals from around the world, captured with the skilled eye of someone who understood wildlife. The drive to Dorothy's house felt both urgent and terrifying. The kitten, wrapped in Jake's work jacket, had stopped crying, a development that could mean peaceful sleep or something far worse. Jake found himself talking to the tiny creature, sharing Cherokee words his grandmother had taught him, prayers for safe passage and second chances. Dorothy answered her door in a faded flannel robe, her silver hair uncombed, eyes holding the particular emptiness that came from too many solitary mornings. But when she saw the bundle in Jake's arms, something fundamental shifted in her expression. Years of professional expertise awakened as she took in the kitten's condition with a single, comprehensive glance. "Bobcat," she whispered, her voice carrying both wonder and concern. "Lynx rufus, probably 3 weeks old." Her hands moved with practiced confidence, checking vital signs while Jake explained where he'd found her. "She's severely dehydrated, malnourished, and that eye infection could blind her permanently if we don't act fast." In that moment, Jake watched Dorothy Harrison transform from a grieving widow into the wildlife expert she'd once been. She disappeared into her house and returned with supplies that suggested her retirement from National Geographic hadn't meant abandoning her calling entirely. Electrolyte solution, tiny feeding bottles, medical equipment that looked both professional and well-maintained. "What's her name?" Dorothy asked as she prepared the first feeding, her movements sure and gentle. Jake hesitated. Naming wild animals was dangerous. It created attachment that complicated the ultimate goal of return to nature. But looking at Dorothy's face, seeing the first spark of purpose he'd witnessed there, he understood that some attachments were healing rather than harmful. "Luna," he said, thinking of his daughter's love for astronomy and the pale green eyes that seemed to reflect moonlight even in daylight. "Her name is Luna." Dorothy's smile was the first genuine expression of joy Jake had seen from her in years. "Luna," she repeated, as the kitten latched onto the bottle with desperate hunger. Latin for moon. Did you know bobcats are primarily nocturnal? They hunt by moonlight, navigate by stars their mothers teach them to read. As Luna fed, both adults felt the strange sensation of purpose returning to their lives. Neither understood yet that this wasn't a simple rescue, that Luna's appearance would unravel secrets that stretched far beyond one abandoned kitten. They only knew that something precious and helpless needed them, and for the first time in years, they were exactly where they needed to be. The first sign that Luna wasn't an ordinary rescue came 3 days after Jake found her. Dorothy had established a routine of round-the-clock feedings, turning her sunroom into a makeshift rehabilitation center with heat lamps, soft blankets, and the kind of specialized equipment that made Jake wonder exactly how much her retirement had really changed her daily life. Luna had responded to treatment with remarkable speed, her infected eye clearing and her appetite returning with a vengeance that required feedings every 2 hours. But it wasn't her physical recovery that troubled Dorothy. It was her behavior. In 40 years of wildlife photography and rehabilitation, she'd never encountered a bobcat kitten that actively sought human contact the way Luna did. Most wildcats, even hand-raised orphans, maintained a certain wariness, a healthy fear that would serve them well upon release. Luna purred when Dorothy approached. She cried when left alone. Most unnaturally, she seemed to recognize the sound of Dorothy's voice from rooms away, responding with chirps and trills that sounded almost conversational. These weren't the behaviors of a wild animal, they were the responses of a creature that had been conditioned to depend on humans. "She's been hand-raised," Dorothy murmured to herself on the 3rd morning, watching Luna play with a feather toy with the kind of focused attention that suggested previous exposure to such enrichment. But by whom, and why was she abandoned? The answer to that question arrived unexpectedly in the form of Dorothy's son Michael, who appeared at her door with a manila folder and the determined expression she remembered from his teenage years when he decided to challenge her decisions. "Mom, we need to talk," Michael said, brushing past her into the living room where Luna's temporary enclosure dominated the space. At 38, he carried himself with the careful precision of someone who managed risks for a living, an insurance adjuster who saw potential disasters in every situation. The sight of Luna, now visibly healthy and playfully batting at a hanging toy, stopped him mid-stride. "Jesus, Mom, that thing's gotten bigger." His voice carried a mixture of amazement and alarm. "Mrs. Chen called me. She said you've been getting strange phone calls, people asking about the animal you're caring for. Do you understand how dangerous this situation is?" Dorothy felt her protective instincts flare. "Her name is Luna, not that thing, and she's hardly dangerous. She weighs 2 pounds, Michael." "Now she weighs 2 pounds. What about when she weighs 30? Michael opened his folder and spread papers across her coffee table. Brochures for Sunset Manor, legal documents, medical assessments. "I've been doing research, Mom. Bobcats can live 25 years. They're not pets. They're wild predators that can seriously injure or kill people. The insurance liability alone—" "Stop!" Dorothy's voice cut through his rehearsed speech with the authority of someone who'd faced down charging elephants and territorial jaguars. "I know exactly what Luna is and what she'll become. I've spent more time with wildcats than you've spent in conference rooms." But Michael pressed on, his voice rising with frustrated concern. "That was 40 years ago, Mom. You're 73 now. Your reflexes aren't what they were. Your judgment—" He stopped himself, but the implication hung in the air like smoke. The accusation stung because it echoed Dorothy's own fears. Madison's death had shattered her confidence in ways she was still discovering. Some mornings she forgot to eat breakfast. She'd found herself standing in rooms with no memory of why she'd entered them. The thought of making a critical error with Luna's care terrified her more than she'd admit. "What exactly are you suggesting, Michael?" He pulled out the legal documents with the careful precision of someone delivering a prepared statement. "I've spoken with attorneys about becoming your power of attorney, just temporarily, until we can ensure you're making safe decisions. And I've contacted the Arizona Game and Fish Department about Luna. They can relocate her to a proper wildlife facility." The betrayal hit Dorothy like a physical blow. Her own son conspiring behind her back, treating her like an incompetent child. But beneath the hurt, she felt something else stirring, a fierce protectiveness that reminded her why she'd once stood up to National Geographic executives and refused to compromise her principles. "Get out," she said quietly. "Mom, be reasonable." "I said get out." Dorothy's voice carried the steel that had once made her voice respected in editorial meetings and press conferences. "Luna stays with me. And if you contact Game and Fish, if you pursue this power of attorney nonsense, you'll discover that I'm far from the helpless old woman you seem to think I am." After Michael left, slamming the door with the frustrated force of someone unaccustomed to losing arguments, Dorothy found herself shaking. Not from anger, though that burned hot in her chest, but from the recognition of how isolated her position had become. Michael wasn't entirely wrong. Caring for Luna was a massive responsibility, one that carried real risks. But he was wrong about her competence, wrong about her judgment, and completely wrong about what Luna meant to her healing process. That evening, as she prepared Luna's nighttime feeding, Dorothy discovered the first concrete clue about the kitten's origin. Cleaning the enclosure, she found a small plastic zip tie that had been partially chewed through, the kind used to secure cage doors in transport carriers. Luna hadn't been abandoned by her mother or orphaned by accident. She'd been deliberately placed behind that building, and someone had wanted her found in a weakened, dependent state. Jake arrived for his daily check just as Dorothy was examining the zip tie under her magnifying glass. One look at her expression told him that their simple rescue had become something more complicated. "Someone's been asking about Luna," he said without preamble. "My daughter's mentioned hearing talk at school about the lady with the baby Bobcat. Word's spreading, Dorothy. We need to be careful." Dorothy showed him the zip tie and shared her growing suspicions about Luna's behavior. Jake's detective instincts, dormant but not dead, began processing the implications. A hand-raised Bobcat Kitten, deliberately placed for discovery, with someone now tracking down her location through community gossip. "This feels like a setup," Jake said finally. "But setup for what?" Before Dorothy could respond, her phone rang. The caller ID showed only a number, but the voice on the other end was professionally pleasant and immediately suspicious. "Ms. Harrison, this is Dr. Richard Sterling from the Desert Wildlife Veterinary Clinic. I understand you're caring for an orphaned bobcat. I'd like to offer my services, free of charge, of course. It's important that wild animals receive proper medical care from licensed professionals." Dorothy met Jake's eyes as she answered, her voice carefully neutral. "That's very generous, Dr. Sterling, but Luna is doing quite well under current care." "I'm sure she is," the voice replied, with just enough emphasis to suggest doubt. "But I do insist, wild animals can carry diseases dangerous to humans, and there are legal requirements for documentation." "I can be there tomorrow morning to examine her properly." After hanging up, Dorothy and Jake sat in silence, both understanding that their quiet rescue had attracted exactly the wrong kind of attention. Dr. Richard Sterling arrived at Dorothy's house precisely at 9 o'clock the following morning, driving a pristine white veterinary van that seemed too clean for someone who regularly treated animals. Dorothy watched from her window as he gathered an extensive collection of equipment, far more than would be needed for a simple wellness check on a 2-pound kitten. Jake had positioned himself across the street, ostensibly repairing a mailbox but actually observing every detail of the interaction. Sterling appeared to be in his early 50s, with the kind of polished professionalism that Dorothy had learned to distrust during her magazine years. His handshake lasted a fraction too long, his smile never quite reached his eyes, and he asked too many questions about Luna's discovery while barely glancing at the kitten herself. "Remarkable specimen," he murmured, making notes on a tablet while Luna played with a feather toy. "The markings are quite unusual. Almost hybrid characteristics, bobcat mixed with perhaps lynx genetics. Extremely rare and valuable for research purposes." Dorothy's expertise allowed her to recognize the subtle inaccuracies in his assessment. Luna's markings were distinctive, but well within normal bobcat parameters. Either Sterling was incompetent, or he was fishing for information while establishing Luna's supposed research value. Neither possibility reassured her. "Dr. Sterling," Dorothy said carefully, "Luna seems healthy and is progressing well toward eventual release. What specifically concerns you about her current care?" Sterling's answer revealed more than he probably intended. He spoke at length about federal regulations, proper documentation, and the dangers of unlicensed wildlife rehabilitation. But his questions kept circling back to Luna's origin, her exact discovery location, and whether Dorothy had noticed any adult bobcats in the area. When he offered to take Luna off her hands for proper professional care, Dorothy's suspicions crystallized into certainty. "That won't be necessary," she replied firmly. "Luna stays here." After Sterling left, making vague promises about returning with proper documentation, Dorothy found herself pacing her living room with the kind of nervous energy she hadn't felt since her investigative reporting days. Something was fundamentally wrong about the entire interaction, but she couldn't quite identify what. The answer came 2 hours later when Jake knocked on her door with grim news. "I followed him," Jake said without preamble. Sterling drove straight to an industrial facility outside town, the old Copper Canyon processing plant that's been empty for 5 years, except it's not empty anymore. There are vehicles there, people moving around, and I heard sounds that didn't belong in an abandoned building. Dorothy felt her blood chill. "What kind of sounds?" "Animals," Jake replied grimly. "Lots of them. Distressed animals." That afternoon, while Luna napped in her sunbeam, Dorothy made phone calls that drew on contacts she hadn't spoken to in years. Her former colleagues at National Geographic had retired or moved on, but the network of wildlife conservationists was smaller and more connected than most people realized. Within hours, she'd confirmed her worst suspicions. Dr. Richard Sterling existed, but his veterinary license had been suspended 18 months ago for falsifying vaccination records. The Desert Wildlife Veterinary Clinic was a shell company with no physical address. Most disturbing of all, Sterling's name appeared in federal databases as a person of interest in exotic animal trafficking investigations across 3 states. "We have to call the authorities," Dorothy told Jake that evening as they watched Luna practice pouncing on imaginary prey. "Which authorities?" Jake asked bitterly. "The same system that let corruption flourish in my police department? The same federal agencies that take months to investigate while animals suffer?" He paused, looking at Luna with an expression Dorothy recognized as protective fury. "Besides, what if Sterling has connections in law enforcement? What if reporting him just gives him advance warning to move his operation?" Dorothy understood Jake's distrust of official channels, but the alternative, 2 civilians investigating what appeared to be a sophisticated criminal operation, seemed equally dangerous. Still, the memory of her forced retirement from National Geographic burned in her chest. She'd lost that fight because she'd trusted the system to protect what mattered. Maybe this time she needed to fight differently. The decision was made for them the next morning when Dorothy discovered Luna's enclosure had been disturbed during the night. Nothing was missing, but the careful arrangement of her sleeping area had been altered, and tiny stress scratches around the lock suggested someone had attempted to open it. Most chilling of all, Luna herself was displaying behavior Dorothy had never seen. She refused to eat, stayed hidden in the darkest corner of her space, and flinched at sounds that had never bothered her before. "She's terrified," Dorothy whispered to Jake as they examined the evidence. "Someone tried to take her and she knows it." That afternoon, Dorothy's phone rang again. This time, Sterling's voice carried a harder edge. "Ms. Harrison, I've been reviewing Luna's case and I'm afraid I must insist on a proper veterinary examination. There are health concerns that require immediate attention." "What health concerns?" Dorothy demanded. "Potential exposure to rabies, for one thing. Wild animals found in urban areas often carry the disease. For public safety, Luna needs to be quarantined in a proper facility immediately." Dorothy knew enough about wildlife disease to recognize the fabrication. Rabies in bobcats was extraordinarily rare, and Luna showed none of the symptoms. Sterling was escalating his approach, using fear tactics and false medical claims to justify seizure. "Dr. Sterling," Dorothy said, her voice carrying 40 years of authority, "Luna remains in my care. If you have legitimate medical concerns, I suggest you contact the Arizona Game and Fish Department through proper channels." "I don't think you understand the seriousness of this situation," Sterling replied, his professional mask finally slipping. "Luna is valuable property, and there are people who will go to considerable lengths to recover their investment. It would be unfortunate if an elderly woman were to be injured during such a recovery operation." The line went dead, leaving Dorothy staring at her phone with the clear understanding that their quiet rescue had become something far more dangerous. That evening, as Dorothy sat with Luna curled in her lap, the kitten had become increasingly clingy as her stress levels rose. She found herself thinking about Madison's final words, "Save all the kitties, Nana." At the time, Dorothy had thought her granddaughter meant the stuffed animals surrounding her hospital bed. Now she wondered if Madison, with the strange prescience children sometimes possessed, had been offering her grandmother a mission that would give meaning to the grief-hollowed years ahead. Jake arrived after sunset with disturbing news from his surveillance of the Copper Canyon facility. He'd observed multiple vehicles arriving and departing, including refrigerated trucks that suggested large-scale animal transport. Most concerning, he'd spotted Sterling's van among several official-looking vehicles, implying the operation had resources and connections that extended beyond simple wildlife trafficking. "Dorothy," Jake said, his voice heavy with concern, "I think Luna isn't just evidence of their crimes. I think she's the key to something much bigger. The way Sterling talked about her genetics, her research value. What if she's not just any bobcat kitten?" Dorothy had been wondering the same thing. Luna's unusual intelligence, her rapid bonding with humans, her distinctive markings that had caught Sterling's immediate attention all suggested she might be more than a random wildlife casualty. But if that was true, then the stakes of keeping her safe had just escalated beyond anything Dorothy had imagined. Late that night, as Dorothy performed Luna's final feeding of the day, she noticed something that made her heart race. In the lamplight, Luna's pale green eyes reflected not yellow like typical bobcats, but with an unusual silvery sheen that Dorothy had only seen once before, in photographs of a legendary bobcat that wildlife researchers had been tracking for over a decade. The ghost cat of the Bradshaw Mountains was famous among conservationists as an unusually large, intelligent bobcat whose genetics appeared to represent a rare throwback to prehistoric lynx characteristics. Researchers had been trying to photograph and study the ghost cat for years, but she remained elusive, almost supernatural in her ability to avoid human contact. If Luna was the ghost cat's kitten, her value to both legitimate researchers and criminal traffickers would be immeasurable. Her genetics could hold keys to understanding bobcat evolution and adaptation. In the wrong hands, she could be bred to produce a line of exotic animals worth millions on the illegal market. Dorothy held Luna closer, feeling the tiny heartbeat against her chest, and realized that their quiet rescue had accidentally positioned them at the center of what might be the most significant wildlife trafficking case in Arizona history. Tomorrow would bring decisions that could save not just Luna, but potentially dozens of other animals trapped in Sterling's operation. But tonight, she simply held a frightened kitten and whispered the kinds of promises that grandmothers make, promises to protect, to fight, and to never, ever give up on those who depend on them for survival. The confrontation Dorothy had been dreading arrived at dawn on a Tuesday morning, but not from the direction she'd expected. Instead of Sterling's white veterinary van, she awoke to find her son Michael on her doorstep, accompanied by two uniformed officers from the Arizona Game and Fish Department and a woman in a crisp business suit who introduced herself as Rebecca Walsh from Adult Protective Services. "Mom," Michael said, his voice carrying the strained patience of someone who believed he was acting in everyone's best interest. "We're here to help. Mrs. Walsh has concerns about your safety, and the wildlife officers need to ensure Luna receives proper care." Dorothy's mind raced as she processed the implications. Michael had followed through on his threats, but the timing was too convenient to be coincidental. Someone had orchestrated this official intervention, and she suspected Sterling's influence extended further than any of them had realized. "Mrs. Harrison," Officer Janet Martinez said, consulting a clipboard with official efficiency, "we've received reports that you're illegally harboring a wild bobcat without proper permits. We need to examine the animal and assess whether removal to a licensed facility is necessary." Rebecca Walsh stepped forward with the predatory sympathy Dorothy had learned to recognize in institutional representatives. "Dorothy, may I call you Dorothy? Your son has expressed concerns about your ability to safely care for both yourself and a dangerous wild animal. We simply want to ensure everyone's well-being." The trap was elegant in its simplicity. If Dorothy refused to cooperate with the wildlife officers, she'd appear unbalanced and defiant, supporting Michael's competency concerns. If she surrendered Luna voluntarily, she'd lose the evidence that could expose Sterling's operation. Either choice would be painted as proof of her declining judgment. But Dorothy Mae Harrison hadn't survived 4 decades of investigative journalism by accepting false choices imposed by others. "Of course," she said, with the gracious cooperation that immediately made everyone suspicious. "Luna is in the sunroom. Officer Martinez, I assume you'll want to see her care documentation as well as the animal herself." As the group moved through her house, Dorothy noticed details that confirmed her suspicions about the coordination behind this visit. Rebecca Walsh's questions were too specific, too focused on Dorothy's connection to Luna rather than general safety concerns. The wildlife officers seemed more interested in Luna's genetics and origin than her current welfare. Someone had briefed them extensively before this visit. Luna, sensing the tension in the room, retreated to the farthest corner of her enclosure and began the low, continuous growling that Dorothy had only heard once before, the night someone had tried to break into her carrier. The kitten's stress response was so extreme that even Officer Martinez seemed taken aback. "This isn't normal fear behavior," Martinez murmured to her partner. "She's acting like she recognizes a specific threat." Dorothy seized the opening. "Luna's been exhibiting unusual stress since someone attempted to break into her enclosure 3 nights ago. I have security footage if you'd like to review it." She didn't actually have security cameras, but the bluff served its purpose of introducing the possibility that Luna's situation involved criminal activity. Rebecca Walsh's expression sharpened. "You didn't report a break-in to police?" "I reported it to the appropriate authorities," Dorothy lied smoothly, watching Walsh's face carefully. The woman's micro-expression of relief confirmed Dorothy's suspicion that this visit was designed to remove Luna before any investigation could begin. While the officials debated next steps, Dorothy excused herself to gather Luna's care records from her bedroom. Instead, she moved quickly to her old computer and sent a pre-written email to Jake with the subject line, "Code Red." Within minutes, Jake would be contacting federal wildlife enforcement and putting into motion the plan they'd developed during their sleepless strategizing sessions. When Dorothy returned to the sunroom, she found the group in heated discussion. Officer Martinez was arguing for a more thorough investigation of Luna's origin, while Walsh pressed for immediate removal to a safe environment. Michael stood to one side, looking increasingly uncomfortable with the aggressive direction his intervention had taken. "Miss Harrison," Walsh said with barely concealed impatience, "we need to resolve this situation quickly. Luna requires specialized care that you simply cannot provide, and your own welfare is at risk." Dorothy pulled out her trump card. "Actually, I think Luna's welfare is exactly why we're all here. Officer Martinez, are you aware that Dr. Richard Sterling, who has been pressuring me to surrender Luna, operates under a suspended veterinary license and is currently under federal investigation for wildlife trafficking?" The room fell silent. Walsh's face went carefully blank while Martinez exchanged sharp glances with her partner. Michael looked stunned, as if he'd suddenly realized he'd been manipulated into participating in something far more complex than elder care concerns. "That's a serious accusation," Martinez said carefully. "Do you have evidence to support these claims?" Before Dorothy could respond, her phone rang. Jake's voice carried urgency, but also satisfaction. "Dorothy, federal wildlife agents are en route to your location. They've been tracking Sterling's operation for months, and Luna's DNA samples from her veterinary records have been matched to the ghost cat. You're sitting on the key evidence in a multi-state trafficking case." Dorothy put the phone on speaker, watching Walsh's expression shift from predatory confidence to barely concealed panic. "Jake, could you repeat that for our visitors?" Jake's voice filled the room with information that transformed everything. The FBI's Wildlife Trafficking Task Force had been building a case against an international smuggling ring that specialized in rare genetic specimens. Luna wasn't just any bobcat. She was the daughter of the legendary ghost cat, whose bloodline represented millions of dollars in potential breeding stock for exotic animal collectors worldwide. Sterling hadn't been trying to acquire Luna for veterinary care. He'd been trying to recover valuable merchandise that had escaped during a transport operation gone wrong. The break-in attempt, the escalating pressure, even this morning's coordinated official visit, all had been orchestrated to retrieve Luna before federal agents could use her DNA to trace the larger conspiracy. Walsh was already backing toward the door when Dorothy's doorbell rang again. This time, the visitors wore FBI windbreakers and carried federal warrants that superseded every local authority in the room. Agent Sarah Chen introduced herself with the efficient authority of someone accustomed to taking control of complex situations. "Miss Harrison, we understand you've been caring for evidence in a federal wildlife trafficking case. Luna's safety is now a matter of national security." The next 2 hours transformed Dorothy's quiet home into a command center. Federal agents interviewed everyone present, while wildlife specialists examined Luna with the kind of expert attention that confirmed everything Dorothy had suspected about her extraordinary nature. Luna's genetics didn't just link her to the ghost cat. They represented a unique evolutionary adaptation that made her bloodline invaluable to conservation research. But the most shocking revelation came when Agent Chen shared the scope of Sterling's operation. The abandoned Copper Canyon facility housed over 60 exotic animals destined for private collectors, research facilities, and breeding operations across the globe. Luna had been the centerpiece of a shipment worth over $2 million, until a transport accident had allowed her to escape near the warehouse where Jake found her. Dr. Sterling has been using his veterinary connections to identify and acquire rare animals, Chen explained. Your refusal to surrender Luna disrupted a delivery timeline that involved buyers in 3 countries. That's why the pressure escalated so quickly. Michael, who had spent the morning believing he was protecting his mother from her own poor judgment, now stared at Dorothy with something approaching awe. His mild-mannered, recently widowed mother had accidentally positioned herself at the center of an international criminal investigation and had managed to protect crucial evidence despite sophisticated attempts at manipulation and intimidation. Rebecca Walsh, it turned out, had received an anonymous tip about Dorothy's dangerous situation from someone who had provided detailed information about Luna's presence and Dorothy's allegedly declining mental state. The tip had included suggestions about coordinating with wildlife officers to ensure Luna's removal appeared official and legitimate. As the federal agents prepared to transport Luna to a secure wildlife facility for her protection during the investigation, Dorothy felt the familiar ache of impending loss. For 2 weeks, Luna had given her life purpose and meaning in ways she hadn't experienced since Madison's death. The kitten's trust, her playful morning greetings, her contented purring during evening feedings, all would be memories within the hour. Agent Chen, perhaps recognizing the depth of Dorothy's attachment, approached with unexpected gentleness. Ms. Harrison, Luna's going to need specialized care during her transition back to wild behaviors. The facility has an opening for a volunteer coordinator with your background and expertise. The position would allow you to continue monitoring her progress while helping with other rescued animals. Dorothy looked at Luna, now sleeping peacefully in a secure carrier designed for her protection rather than her imprisonment, and felt something shift in her chest. Madison's voice seemed to whisper from memory, "Save all the kitties, Nana." Maybe this wasn't an ending. Maybe this was the beginning of exactly what she was meant to do. The raid on the Copper Canyon facility happened at dawn the following day, and Dorothy insisted on being present despite Agent Chen's concerns about civilian safety. What they discovered in the abandoned processing plant would haunt her for months afterward. Dozens of exotic animals crammed into makeshift cages, many showing signs of severe stress, malnutrition, and medical neglect that spoke to months or years of suffering. Dorothy moved through the facility with Agent Chen and the wildlife rescue team, her trained eye cataloging horrors that the federal agents could document but not fully comprehend. A pair of ocelot kittens huddled together in a cage barely large enough for one adult house cat. 3 juvenile mountain lions paced endlessly in concrete enclosures with no enrichment, their eyes holding the vacant stare of animals whose spirits had been systematically broken. Most heartbreaking of all, an adult female bobcat, unmistakably Luna's mother based on her distinctive markings, lay motionless in a transport carrier, breathing but unresponsive to human approach. "How long has she been like this?" Dorothy asked the veterinary team leader, Dr. Patricia White, who was performing emergency triage on the rescued animals. "Based on her condition, I'd estimate she's been in captivity for at least 6 months, possibly longer," Dr. White replied grimly. "She's showing classic symptoms of learned helplessness. This cat has given up hope of escape or rescue. The psychological trauma may be more severe than the physical damage." Dorothy knelt beside the carrier, speaking softly to the motionless bobcat in the same tone she'd used with Luna during those first frightening days. "Your baby is safe," she whispered. "Luna is safe and healthy and waiting for you." At the mention of Luna's name, the adult bobcat's ears twitched almost imperceptibly, the first sign of responsiveness anyone had observed. The scope of Sterling's operation became clearer as investigators processed evidence throughout the day. Financial records revealed a network spanning 7 states and 3 countries, with individual animals selling for prices that ranged from thousands to hundreds of thousands of dollars, depending on their rarity and genetic value. Luna's mother, identified through DNA testing as the legendary ghost cat, had been valued at over $500,000 for her breeding potential alone. But it was the discovery of Sterling's personal files that provided the most disturbing insights into his motivation and methods. His son Tommy's medical records filled an entire filing cabinet: specialist consultations, experimental treatment options, insurance denials that had pushed the family toward financial ruin. Mixed among the medical documents were photos of Tommy at various stages of his illness, smiling despite his obvious physical struggles, holding drawings he'd made of his father and various animals. "Jesus," Jake muttered, reading over Dorothy's shoulder as she examined Sterling's personal journal. "Listen to this entry. Tommy asked me today if animals go to heaven. I told him yes, of course they do. How can I explain that I'm destroying their lives on Earth to save his?" Dorothy felt a familiar twist in her chest. The same complexity of emotion she'd experienced when photographing poachers in Africa who killed endangered animals to feed their starving families. Evil was rarely simple, and Sterling's crimes were motivated by the same desperate love that drove her own fierce protection of Luna. The difference lay not in the strength of their devotion, but in their willingness to sacrifice others for those they loved. Sterling himself was arrested at his home, where investigators found him in his son's bedroom, reading bedtime stories to a child so frail that Dorothy's heart broke just looking at him. Tommy Sterling was 12 years old but appeared younger, his body ravaged by cerebral palsy and the complications that had made his care so expensive. When officers entered to make the arrest, Tommy had been showing his father a new drawing, a picture of a man in a white coat surrounded by various animals, all smiling. "Is Daddy in trouble?" Tommy asked Agent Chen, his speech slurred but his intelligence clearly unimpaired. "He works really hard to take care of sick animals. Sometimes he has to work at night and it makes him sad, but he says it's important to help creatures that can't help themselves." Dorothy watched Sterling's face crumble as he realized his son had known about his nighttime activities, but had interpreted them through the lens of a child's trust in his father's goodness. The man who had threatened Dorothy, orchestrated Luna's near removal, and overseen months of animal suffering, was also a father who read bedtime stories and answered questions about animal heaven with tenderness that couldn't be faked. The legal proceedings that followed were swift, but brought little satisfaction. Sterling pleaded guilty to federal wildlife trafficking charges in exchange for cooperation that led to arrests across the international network. His sentencing hearing became a study in the complexity of justice. Victim impact statements from conservation organizations, medical testimony about Tommy's condition, and Sterling's own statement that wavered between genuine remorse and desperate justification. "I know what I did was wrong," Sterling said, his voice breaking as he addressed the court. "I know I caused suffering to innocent animals, and I know I taught my son that love justifies any action. But I also know that every dollar I made went toward treatments that gave Tommy additional months of life, additional moments of joy that he wouldn't have had otherwise. I don't expect forgiveness, but I need people to understand that monsters aren't born. They're made by impossible choices in impossible circumstances." Judge Maria Santos sentenced Sterling to 18 months in federal prison, followed by 5 years of probation, during which he would be required to perform 2,000 hours of community service with wildlife rehabilitation organizations. Tommy would live with his maternal grandparents during his father's incarceration, his ongoing medical care funded by the seizure and sale of Sterling's assets. But the cruelest twist came 3 weeks after Sterling began serving his sentence. Tommy Sterling died peacefully in his sleep, his small body finally succumbing to complications that no amount of money could have prevented indefinitely. Dorothy attended the funeral, standing in the back of a crowded church, while a 12-year-old's life was celebrated by people who had no idea their presence was mourning not just a child's death but the destruction of a father's soul. Sterling, granted temporary release for his son's funeral, delivered a eulogy that haunted everyone present. "Tommy loved animals more than anything," he said, his voice hollow with grief. "He would have been heartbroken to know that animals suffered because of me. I failed him not by going to prison, but by teaching him through my actions that love without moral boundaries isn't love at all. It's just another form of cruelty." The truth that shattered everything Dorothy thought she understood about Luna's rescue emerged 6 weeks after Sterling's arrest, buried in documents that federal investigators initially dismissed as irrelevant to the trafficking case. Jake discovered it while volunteering to help organize evidence, his detective instincts drawing him to inconsistencies that others had overlooked. The revelation began with a discrepancy in transport schedules. According to Sterling's meticulously kept records, Luna should have been delivered to a private collector in Dubai 3 days before Jake found her behind the warehouse. But veterinary records showed she'd been in Sterling's facility for over 2 weeks before her scheduled departure, healthy and thriving under professional care. Jake brought his concerns to Agent Chen, who initially seemed reluctant to pursue what appeared to be simple paperwork errors. But when Jake pressed for access to Sterling's personal communications from the weeks surrounding Luna's disappearance, a different story began to emerge, one that challenged every assumption they'd made about the case. The breakthrough came in a series of encrypted messages between Sterling and someone identified only as Phoenix in his contacts. The messages, decoded by FBI specialists, revealed a conversation that made Dorothy's blood run cold when Agent Chen finally shared them. "The kitten is ready for transport, but I'm having second thoughts. She's too intelligent, too responsive. This feels different than the others." Phoenix's response was swift and brutal. "Sentiment is a luxury we can't afford. The buyer has paid in full. Complete the delivery or face the consequences." Sterling's reply, sent at 2:47 a.m. on the night before Luna's discovery, contained just 4 words: "I can't do this." What followed was a digital trail that revealed Sterling's desperate attempt to save Luna while maintaining his cover within the trafficking network. He'd removed her from the facility under the pretense of conducting a final health check, then driven to various locations around Prescott before ultimately leaving her near the warehouse district where Jake would find her during his morning rounds. But the most devastating revelation came in Sterling's final message to Phoenix. "The kitten is gone. Transport vehicle was broken into during a routine stop. I'm reporting her as stolen. Total loss. We'll absorb the cost and move forward with remaining inventory." Sterling had deliberately sabotaged his own operation to save Luna, then constructed an elaborate lie to protect himself from Phoenix's retaliation. The break-in attempt at Dorothy's house hadn't been Sterling trying to reclaim Luna. It had been Phoenix's operatives acting on intelligence that Sterling's story about the theft was fabricated. Agent Chen delivered this information to Dorothy and Jake in the secure conference room at the federal building, her expression grave with implications they were still processing. "Richard Sterling didn't orchestrate Luna's rescue," she said slowly. "He conducted it. Everything we thought we knew about his motivations needs to be reconsidered." Dorothy felt the foundations of her understanding shift beneath her. The man she'd seen as a clear antagonist, the criminal who had threatened her safety and Luna's welfare, had actually risked his own life and freedom to ensure Luna would be found and cared for by someone with the expertise to help her survive. "But the phone calls," Dorothy protested. "The threats, the attempts to take her, all genuine," Agent Chen confirmed. "But not from Sterling. Phoenix's network had identified you as Luna's current caretaker through community gossip and social media posts. Sterling was trying to retrieve her before Phoenix's people could locate her, probably intending to hide her more effectively." Jake ran his hands through his hair, the detective in him furious at missing such crucial evidence. So when Sterling called offering veterinary care, he was trying to assess Luna's condition and Dorothy's ability to protect her. Agent Chen finished. His increasing desperation in those calls wasn't about recovering valuable merchandise. It was about preventing Phoenix from reclaiming her. The full scope of Sterling's deception became clear as investigators dug deeper into the trafficking network's communications. Phoenix, whose real identity remained unknown, had suspected Sterling of growing soft toward the animals in his care. Several messages referenced concerns about Sterling's decreasing reliability and emotional attachment to inventory. Luna's disappearance had confirmed Phoenix's suspicions and triggered a systematic investigation of Sterling's activities. Sterling knew he was under surveillance from his own people, Agent Chen explained. Every action he took had to appear consistent with his role in the organization, even while he was actually trying to protect Luna. The aggressive phone calls, the medical threats, he was performing for Phoenix's benefit while trying to warn Dorothy about the real danger. Dorothy thought about Sterling's voice during those final phone calls, the strange emphasis on certain words that had seemed like threats, but might have been warnings. When he said people would go to considerable lengths to recover their investment, she said slowly, he wasn't threatening me. He was telling me that others would come. The revelation transformed Sterling from villain to tragic hero, but it also exposed Dorothy and Luna to far greater danger than they'd realized. Phoenix's network remained operational and highly motivated to recover their expensive asset. Worse, they now knew that Sterling had betrayed them, eliminating any protection his position within the organization might have provided. Agent Chen's next words confirmed Dorothy's worst fears. We have intelligence suggesting Phoenix's operatives are still in the area. Luna remains their primary target, but they now view anyone connected to her rescue as a potential threat to be eliminated. The federal protection program that followed felt like a surreal nightmare. Dorothy found herself relocated to a safe house 40 miles outside Prescott, separated from Luna for the first time since her rescue, and surrounded by agents who treated her like a valuable witness rather than a person. The isolation was crushing, made worse by the knowledge that her attempt to save one small animal had exposed her to the attention of criminals sophisticated enough to operate internationally while maintaining complete anonymity. Jake, deemed equally at risk due to his role in Luna's discovery and the subsequent investigation, joined Dorothy at the safe house after his daughters were relocated to stay with relatives in Oklahoma. The two unlikely allies found themselves playing endless games of cards while armed guards monitored perimeter cameras and federal agents processed intelligence about Phoenix's activities. I keep thinking about Tommy, Jake said during one of their long conversations about the case's moral complexity. That kid died believing his father was a hero who saved sick animals. Maybe that's the most important truth of all. Dorothy nodded, understanding what Jake meant about the relativity of truth and the complexity of human motivation. Sterling's crimes were real and had caused genuine suffering. But his attempt to save Luna, motivated by some mixture of guilt, exhaustion, and recognition of her unique intelligence, had also been real. Both versions of Richard Sterling existed simultaneously, and Dorothy was beginning to understand that most people contained similar contradictions. The break in the case came from an unexpected source: Tommy Sterling's medical records. FBI analysts, searching for any possible connection between Sterling's trafficking activities and his son's treatment, discovered that several of Tommy's specialists had received anonymous donations that precisely covered the family's insurance co-pays and experimental treatment costs. The donations, traced through multiple shell companies and offshore accounts, led directly back to Phoenix's financial network. Phoenix hadn't just been Sterling's handler in the trafficking operation, they had been his son's secret benefactor, creating a dependency that made Sterling's betrayal not just dangerous, but personally devastating. Tommy's medical care had been purchased with blood money from exotic animal sales, and Phoenix had used that knowledge to ensure Sterling's continued cooperation even as his conscience rebelled against the work. Agent Chen shared this discovery with a mixture of professional satisfaction and human sadness. Sterling probably didn't know the source of those donations until it was too late to refuse them. By the time he understood the moral compromise he'd made, Tommy's life depended on continuing the relationship. The revelation explained Sterling's increasingly erratic behavior in the weeks before Luna's disappearance. He'd been caught between his love for his son, his growing horror at the suffering he was causing, and his recognition that Phoenix's generosity came with strings that could strangle his family's future. Luna had represented more than just another trafficking victim. She had been the breaking point where Sterling's humanity finally overcame his desperation. But the most shocking truth was still to come, revealed in Sterling's own words during a clandestine meeting with federal agents that Agent Chen had been authorized to record. Speaking from his prison cell, Sterling provided the final piece of information that would change everything Dorothy understood about Luna's significance and her own role in the larger story. "Phoenix isn't just a smuggler," Sterling said, his voice hollow with exhaustion and grief. "They're a collector. The animals aren't just merchandise, they're specimens in a private zoo that houses the rarest genetics on the planet." Luna wasn't being sold to someone else. She was going home to Phoenix personally, to be bred with other rare cats in a program designed to create entirely new hybrid lines. He paused, looking directly at the camera with eyes that held too much knowledge. "And Phoenix has been watching Dorothy Harrison for years. Her work with National Geographic, her expertise with rare species, her forced retirement for protecting endangered animals. Phoenix knows exactly who she is and what she represents. Luna's rescue wasn't accidental, it was a recruitment test." 6 months after Sterling's revelations about Phoenix's true intentions, Dorothy stood in the education center of the Desert Wildlife Conservation Sanctuary, watching Luna demonstrate her remarkable intelligence to a group of elementary school children. At nearly 1 year old, Luna had grown into a magnificent young bobcat, her distinctive pale green eyes and unusual markings drawing gasps of wonder from the students who listened intently as Dorothy explained the difference between wild animals and pets. "Luna can never be released into the wild," Dorothy told the children, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades understanding animal behavior. She was separated from her mother too young to learn the hunting and survival skills she would need. But she has a different kind of important job now, teaching people like you about protecting wild spaces where her cousins can live free and safe." The sanctuary had become Dorothy's new world, a purpose-built facility funded by the seizure of Phoenix's assets after a coordinated international law enforcement operation had finally dismantled the trafficking network. Phoenix themselves had never been captured. The mastermind behind the operation had vanished like smoke when the walls began closing in, leaving behind only empty bank accounts and abandoned properties across 3 continents. But the rescued animals needed care regardless of whether their captors faced justice, and Dorothy had found herself uniquely qualified to oversee their rehabilitation and integration into educational programs. Luna had become the sanctuary's star ambassador, her unusual background allowing her to demonstrate both the intelligence of wild cats and the tragic consequences of removing them from their natural families. Jake had joined the sanctuary as head of security, his law enforcement background and Cherokee heritage combining to create an approach to wildlife protection that honored both legal requirements and traditional wisdom about human-animal relationships. His daughters, Emma and Sarah, now college sophomores majoring in wildlife biology and veterinary medicine respectively, spent their summer breaks working as junior educators, carrying forward the lessons they'd learned from their father's involvement in Luna's rescue. The healing had been gradual but transformative for everyone involved. Dorothy's relationship with her son Michael had evolved from the patronizing concern of a child managing an aging parent to genuine respect for her expertise and mission. Michael now served on the sanctuary's board of directors, bringing his insurance background to help other wildlife rehabilitation facilities navigate the complex liability issues that often prevented them from expanding their educational programs. Even Sterling had found a form of redemption through tragedy. Released early from federal prison due to his cooperation in dismantling Phoenix's network, he had dedicated himself to establishing a foundation that provided ethical funding for families facing catastrophic medical expenses. The Richard Thomas Sterling Memorial Foundation, named for Tommy, worked with law enforcement to identify victims of desperation-driven crimes and provide resources that removed the temptation to choose illegal solutions for legitimate problems. "I can't bring back the animals that suffered because of my choices," Sterling had said during the Foundation's inaugural fundraising dinner, speaking to an audience that included Dorothy, Jake, and many of the federal agents who had investigated his case. "But I can try to prevent other parents from facing the impossible choice between their child's life and their moral compass." Tommy would want his legacy to be protection, not destruction. But the most remarkable transformation had occurred in Luna's mother, the legendary ghost cat, who had been rescued from Sterling's facility in a state of severe psychological trauma. Dr. Patricia White's patient rehabilitation had slowly coaxed the adult bobcat back from the learned helplessness that had nearly destroyed her spirit, and the reunion between mother and daughter had provided both cats with healing that purely clinical care could never have achieved. The reunion had taken place in a carefully controlled environment, with Dorothy and Dr. White monitoring every interaction between the traumatized mother and her human-bonded kitten. Luna's response to seeing her mother for the first time in nearly a year had been immediate and profound. She had approached the older cat with soft, chirping vocalizations that seemed to unlock something fundamental in the ghost cat's wounded psyche. "It's like watching two parts of a broken soul finding each other again," Dr. White had observed as the mother and daughter cats engaged in the gentle headbutting and mutual grooming that indicated acceptance and affection. Luna remembers being loved, and her mother remembers having someone to love. The ghost cat, now known as Luna's mother rather than by her legendary nickname, had regained much of her natural wariness and hunting instincts, but she chose to remain near the sanctuary rather than disappearing back into the deep wilderness. Wildlife cameras regularly captured her watching Luna's educational demonstrations from the tree line, and she had been observed teaching her daughter hunting behaviors during supervised outdoor sessions. "She's making a choice," Dorothy explained to visitors who questioned why the adult bobcat didn't simply return to complete wildness. "She could leave any time. We've never restricted her movement. But she seems to understand that Luna serves an important purpose here, and she's choosing to be part of that mission rather than resuming her solitary life." The arrangement had created something unprecedented in wildlife rehabilitation. A multi-generational bobcat family that bridged the gap between wild and domestic, serving as living examples of the complex relationships possible between humans and animals when those relationships were built on respect rather than ownership. Dorothy's favorite time of day came during the evening feeding routine, when the public programs were finished and the sanctuary settled into the quieter rhythms of animal care. She would sit with Luna in the large outdoor enclosure they shared, watching the young bobcat practice the hunting behaviors her mother had finally been able to teach her, while Luna's mother watched from her preferred spot in a nearby oak tree. These moments reminded Dorothy of similar evenings with Madison, when her granddaughter would curl up beside her on the porch swing and listen to stories about the animals Dorothy had photographed around the world. Madison's final request, "Save all the kitties, Nana," had taken on layers of meaning that neither of them could have imagined during those last precious conversations. In saving Luna, Dorothy had indeed saved far more than one kitten. The investigation, triggered by Luna's rescue, had led to the liberation of hundreds of trafficked animals and the dismantling of an international criminal network. The sanctuary, established with seized assets, now provided homes and purpose for dozens of animals who could never be returned to the wild, while educating thousands of people annually about wildlife conservation. But perhaps most importantly, Dorothy had saved herself. The purposelessness and grief that had nearly consumed her after losing Harold and Madison had been transformed into a mission that gave meaning to every day. At 74, she was more professionally fulfilled than she had been during her National Geographic years, combining her expertise with hands-on animal care in ways that created tangible, immediate benefits for both individual animals and conservation education. The sanctuary's success had attracted attention from conservation organizations worldwide, and Dorothy found herself consulting on similar projects across the country. The model they had developed, using non-releasable animals as ambassadors for their wild relatives while providing those animals with enriched, purposeful lives, was being replicated from California to Florida, creating a network of education centers that served both rescued animals and human communities. Luna herself had exceeded every expectation for an animal born into captivity and raised by humans. Her intelligence continued to amaze visitors and researchers alike as she learned to respond to dozens of verbal commands, navigate complex enrichment puzzles, and demonstrate natural behaviors on cue for educational presentations. Yet she retained the wild dignity that reminded everyone who met her that she was not a pet, but an ambassador for her species. The evening of the sanctuary's first anniversary celebration, Dorothy sat on the porch of her small residence on the sanctuary grounds, watching Luna and her mother share their evening meal in the enclosure visible from her window. Jake joined her with 2 cups of coffee, a ritual they had developed during their months of friendship forged in crisis and sustained through shared purpose. "Any regrets?" Jake asked, settling into the chair beside her as they watched the bobcat's peaceful interaction. Dorothy considered the question seriously. The past year had brought dangers she could never have imagined when she was simply a lonely widow grieving her losses. But it had also brought purposes and relationships that had transformed her understanding of what the final chapters of a life could contain. "Madison used to say that adventures weren't about going somewhere exciting," Dorothy replied finally. "She said adventures were about doing something that matters, even when it scares you." She smiled, watching Luna demonstrate her problem-solving skills by manipulating a puzzle feeder her mother had been ignoring. "I think she would have loved all of this. The sanctuary, Luna's intelligence, even the scary parts that led us here." As if responding to her name, Luna looked toward Dorothy's porch and chirped the greeting call she had developed specifically for her human partner. Dorothy chirped back, maintaining the interspecies conversation that had become as natural as breathing, while Luna's mother watched with the patient attention of someone who had learned to accept that love could take many forms and cross many boundaries. Tomorrow would bring new school groups, new opportunities to teach children about respecting wildlife, and new possibilities for expanding the sanctuary's mission. But tonight, Dorothy simply enjoyed the profound satisfaction of knowing that sometimes, when you open your heart to saving one small life, you discover that life had been waiting to save you in return. At 73, Dorothy Harrison discovered something that might surprise you. Your most meaningful chapter can begin when everyone else thinks your story should be ending. After losing her husband Harold and her precious granddaughter Madison, Dorothy felt invisible. Another elderly woman society had quietly written off. Sound familiar? Maybe you felt that same crushing loneliness, that sense that your best years are behind you, that no one really needs what you have to offer anymore. But when a tiny, terrified bobcat kitten entered Dorothy's life, everything changed. She didn't just save Luna, Luna saved her right back. Dorothy transformed from a forgotten widow into a wildlife conservation hero. Using decades of expertise she thought the world no longer valued. At 74, she's running educational programs, consulting internationally, and proving that wisdom earned through a lifetime of experience is society's most underutilized resource. Your golden years aren't about slowing down. They're about stepping into the purpose you were always meant to fulfill. Every skill you've mastered, every lesson you've learned, every hardship you've survived has prepared you for something extraordinary that's still waiting to unfold. What dream have you set aside that could still transform lives, including your own? When did you last feel truly needed for who you are, not just what you once were?